My name is Ed Miller. I've got a patent on a chainsaw tool, and we're going to be looking at that tool today. We're visiting a job site here in the Great Smoky Mountains, and we're going to be doing some dovetailing to some 6x12 white pine logs. Actually, we got to start on the job the other day, and we've already done some of the dovetails, some both right and left hand notches. The guys up here have already started putting the cabin together. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to do any machining of the half logs, but I'm going to show you what a half log is that's used for both starter and caps on the logs. And also some things about the job site itself. First of all, our entryway is actually, the entry to the house is actually off the porch over here. Now ideally, had I been here, or someone knowledgeable had been here when the logs arrived, the materials would actually have been staged, unloaded over here on this side. That way, when we're cutting, we could unload the logs across the cutting fixtures and right on up the stairs and on into the house, because what's going to happen now, we've already got about 2/3 of the house is already cut, but we're having to now negotiate around this pile or hand the material up over the wall. So it's quite an inconvenience if you don't think about this beforehand. So to give some consideration how these logs are going to get into the house once the house is started. In other words, where is the doorway? And try to pile the materials as far from the door as you can so that you can cut them and then walk them right into the house, or you can take them up on the subfloor and cut. The subfloor was just put on this house a couple of days ago, and we've had one weekend since that's been done, so we didn't want anything left on the subfloor over the weekend. So here's the real-life situation. Another thing that I'd like for you to look at maybe a little bit later on is actually the logs were, this particular bundle here was actually stacked. The top side is facing up, and we have a chink groove on the outside. It's facing in that direction on this bundle, and it's facing this direction on the other bundle. So we have to be very careful because we're working with both a right and a left-hand fixture today. You have to be careful that when you take a log off of this pile and put a right-hand end on this side, you take a log off this pile and you put a notch on this end, it will actually be a left hand. So even when you put the materials together, it's best to have all the orientation the same, so that irregardless of whether you're putting a right hand or a left hand notch on the material, you get used to handling things. And of course, the hotter it is out here on a job site, the less time you're going to have, or the less logic you're actually going to apply to a lot of the moves that you make. So we've got our material staged in this area, and we're just going to make do. I'm going to bring it from here to our cutting fixture and then offload back here in this staging area. Now they can cut out here and take the logs up in shorter versions, cut to length as needed, or they can take the logs up there and cut them on the job site, on actually the subfloor. So they have that choice. One other thing, we didn't have the luxury of actually going over a clean floor plan to know how many short logs we were going to be using. Again, an ideal situation would be to take the floor plan and end up with an exact cut sheet specifying how many short logs you're going to need. If you're going to have logs between windows and doors, if you're going to be 3 foot long or 4 foot long, it's nice to know that beforehand in case we run into a log that has an imperfection in it that we want to cut out. Another thing about imperfections, before I forget, all the people I've worked with, and this is a fresh crew, we work with them on one of the job here in the Smoky Mountain area, but we haven't developed that rapport well enough for me to tell them, almost spiritually, that if there's an imperfection in the log, that there's a place for that in the house. Perhaps the imperfection, if it's on the inside of the house, it can be placed behind cabinets or in a closet or in another area that is not going to be as conspicuous as perhaps right above the fireplace mantel. So try to be thinking about where that particular log might be placed if it does have an imperfection. One of the first things I did when we were cutting here a couple days ago, I found a rock that had actually been part of the log, and it was close to the bottom side of the log. And what I did with that when I cut the notch is I actually went ahead and placed it on the subfloor so that it could be the first part of the first course full log, so that it actually is going to be covered by baseboard. So you want to try, and if you're doing the cutting yourself or having somebody doing the cutting, make sure that the cutting person has an idea of where this log is going to be used so that they can make some decisions. You're talking about a pretty high-priced product here when you start having to cut 1 and 2 foot sections out of the middle of the log just almost in a random, haphazard manner. You want to be trying to think about where that log can go so that you can utilize the log if in fact it is structurally sound. You got to remember that. You may run across a log that does have some softness to it, some punkiness as we call it in the center of the log. You will certainly want to cut that out. But provided the imperfection is, shall we say, man-made, sometimes we can conceal that in these places like the closets, like behind cabinets and so forth. The sawhorses here, you might want to take a note that we simply have just a wooden screw here that kind of fastens against this 2x4, and there's a square slot in here so that we can just slide the 2x4 in. And we can adjust these sawhorse or cradles as far apart as we want to. If we were working with 30-foot, 40-foot material, we might have these spread apart 15 to 20 feet. You just get a longer piece of wood. The nice thing about this is that the sawhorses will not tip over. They may become loose and a little bit rickety feeling, but they will not tip over. You definitely need a strong set of sawhorse type cradle to work your logs on. These are quite low. In fact, I'll tell you how high they are here. If you're going to be cutting material using a large saw and material that's basically 12 inches tall, these sawhorses are around 22 inches high off the ground. Now that's a height for me. I'm basically the only one that uses the sawhorses. They don't get used very much. So be thinking about how high you want to make your sawhorses, not necessarily because of this being a finished length, but when we turn the log up, you'll see that our work height is once again up here. You could put adjustable features on the bottom of the legs, and that might be some benefit for you. You can see that I've had to kind of chink underneath here, if you will, with some pieces of wood to get this level. The reason I need it level, if you put a log on top of here and it's tilted, you may have an imbalance there and the log could possibly fall over, and you don't want that. So get them as level as you can. I just eyeball this and make sure that they're level to one another. That's probably more important than whether or not they're both perfectly level. You get this condition, the log will wobble on you, or any piece of material is going to wobble on you. So it's more important to get them level to one another than it is necessarily to get them perfectly level with gravity. So we've got our sawhorses set up. We've got our power box, union common junction box here. What I try and do is keep my saw on one side of the sawhorses, sorry, the circular saw. I keep my chainsaw on the other side so that if I'm traveling back and forth, you don't end up with the wires becoming tangled with one another. What we'll try and do for a while is maybe work from one end and do a lot of left or right hands by themselves, and then maybe wander to the other end. We've got several of both we need to do, so we'll end up showing you both of those notches. A little bit about the fixture. We'll have two of them. This one here happens to be a left-hand fixture, and this one here is a right-hand fixture. To determine whether you've got a right hand or a left hand, if you were looking at the house from the outside, just like we're doing here, this particular wall, the notches on that end of the wall we're calling right hand. The notches on this end we call left hand. Now, if we were to go around the corner and re-examine the house, looking at the outside from this manner, again, the notches to our left would be still left hand. The notches to our right would be right hand. All the right hand notches are identical to one another. All the left hand notches are identical to one another. Anytime you have a pattern such as a dovetail like this, they must have the dovetail pins in the same relative position on the log to one another. You can't simply just put a pin anywhere you want it. It has to be symmetrical on both the rights and left so that when you start putting them together, they match. These fixtures are something that I've developed and used for a number of years now, and you can see that if I'm looking at the outside of the log, which has the smallest portion of the dovetail, this is the outside, would be the outside of the dovetail, this being the inside, this would then be a left-hand fixture. And just so that I don't forget, occasionally I'll write on here left hand. So here's a left-hand fixture, and you can see the right-hand fixture. So we have a distinct right and left version here. Commonly, this type of dovetail is called Appalachian. This particular size is for 6x12. and it features a 15-degree angle. Sometimes this angle will vary. Rarely will it get over 15 on a 6x12. I've run it up to near 20 on some jobs, and it's shallow, getting down to around 10 degrees if you have up to an 8-inch thick material. We're going to go ahead and I can't think of anything else to say offhand. The material that we're stacking over here, also before we started stacking the material, we leveled the runners on the ground, leveled them up to where our piles wouldn't fall over and end up in a ditch around the foundation. So you want to try to keep things as level as you can. We've had some rain here. We had some rain here yesterday, so at the end of the day we recover our materials that are not being used. Once they're in the house, it's really difficult to cover them up, and I would suggest just leaving them open, because you want it, if it's going to get wet, you want it to be able to dry out. So we will recover the materials at the end of the workday today, and things, like I said, are kept as level as possible. Your work area also needs to be relatively free of rocks almost this size, because something like this, when you're carrying a heavy log, if you happen to step on this rock just in the wrong way, it's possibly going to do some damage to your ankle. So you want to make sure that you don't have anything really out of the question just lying about. I went ahead and just kind of scooped these wooden pieces up out of the way just a little bit ago, so that I'm not walking around on them all day. Well, we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to get, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get my nail belt on, get some gloves on, get some help out here, and we'll start cutting some dovetails. What I'd like to do, there's not a prepared script up on this job site on this particular cutting the dovetail features. What I'd like to do is just talk out loud and hopefully bring 20 years of experience into what I'm doing, and I'll be talking out loud and trying to tell you what I'm thinking, because there's things that you need to be thinking about long before you pick your saw up to make your cut. So I'll be right back. One thing I do want to mention about this particular job, I'm here as an independent contractor specifically just to cut notches. What I prearranged with the general contractor was to have one helper available to help me tote the logs from the staging area over here to our sawhorses, and then of course on over to just a resting place before they're installed in the wall. So I've got some people here helping me. We'll go ahead and get started on this thing. The first thing I wanted to do, I'm on this particular job, since we don't have a cut sheet, normally I would take and cut both ends of half of the job. We've got basically 72 notches to do on this job. I would cut 36 notches on 18 logs, so that we've got 18 right hand, 18 left hand. That's half the total number. Then I would divide the remaining 36 notches. I would take 18 logs individually, put a notch on one end, right hand or left hand, and then just the reverse, right hand or left hand on the remaining 18, so that you've got a mixture of log lengths to use on the job. On this particular job, we're primarily putting single notches on individual logs. There was one exception to that, and that was some logs that we've got over here piled on the subfloor to use on both the front corners. They happen to be identical lengths of 39 inches, so I'm cutting those logs to length as I cut the longer logs. Now the beautiful part about this is that those 39-inch logs can be selected from logs that are maybe otherwise unusable in full length. If it's bent, bowed, or twisted, you can generally find the shorter log lengths are available in these longer sticks. So I'm continually looking for a 39-inch piece, because I still need several of those. But the first thing I'm going to do to this log, I'm going to check to see how straight it is. And this is real straight. There's no bends, warps, or twists. I'm going to go ahead and square the end up. Take a framing square, single mark across that. In this case, we're using a 16-inch diameter power saw, like you hear in the background. And for some reason, we're without power. Now we're ready. This is the first cut I've made today. I don't care how long you've owned your saw, you always want to check at least that first cut. Make sure you're happy with the way that saw is set. Another thing for you people who are just getting into the building business, it does no good to check your cut with this framing square if the framing square itself is not square. So first thing you want to check is make sure your tools are proper. Anyway, assuming that for the moment is, we've got a good square cut. I'm going to tilt this to where the bottom of the log is actually facing up. I've already oriented the fixtures right and left incorrectly. I'll go ahead and get the correct combination here. And I'm going to load this with the fixture actually upside down. The reason for that, first of all, we've got gravity working for us. The fixture is already located in place against this surface. Since it registers against the inside of the house, remembering that the chink groove down here is on the outside of the house, I'm going to pull this fixture against the inside face and against the bottom. And every cut we'll do on this house registers in that same manner. I'm going to secure the outside clamping screws first, and then the bottom clamp screws. These don't need to be tight, just enough to where this fixture doesn't slip around. Since we've already done some cutting on the house, the adjusting screws that give us our setback have already been adjusted. And quite simply, this is what gives us our setback or the length of the pin. On this house, we've taken the width of the log and added 1 inch to that to determine what this setback is. And we've already checked our setback, but after we make our cut, we'll double check that notch after it's been cut. So all of the equipment has already been adjusted, and for this job has been tested. So we're now ready to start making our notch. Okay, we're going to go ahead and make this cut. One of the things that I do religiously on a job is to pull my chips to the same side of the log. We've got this particular log oriented with the chink groove here on the outside. So I'm going to make my cuts to where I'm pulling the chips to the inside. Notice when we roll this log, I'll actually be over there making the cut on the other side. The first cut I'm going to make is my incision straight down. What's going to keep this saw from cutting this fixture is, of course, the extension of the chainsaw guide beyond the cutting tooth, which has to do with your setback. Again, on these fixtures here, 1/4 inch is what the fixtures were designed for, so that's what these saws are set up for. We're going to go ahead and make the cuts. Just kind of see how this goes. A vertical cut is all the way to the bottom. Now, after I've taken and rough cut this block off, because I've always had the fear that chips may have gotten underneath that guide, I just real quickly brushed off the chips off the wear plate surfaces. I'm now going to take and tilt this saw up, because I know with the setting that I've got on all this that I can tolerate that. And actually, I want to make sure by tilting it up, I'm going to be running on a very small portion of the guide, so the likelihood of chips getting under there is pretty remote. And plus, when I tilt it up, there's actually going to be a little bit of a curvature to this notch, which means it's going to fit real tight around the outside. So I'm going to make my first cut is going to be just a rapid cut to make sure that there weren't any chips under the guide. Now I'm going to resurface both of these areas, the vertical that's one side of the notch. We'll go ahead and roll our material. And this time I'm going to cut again from the inside, which is toward you. And that's the finished cut. Again, by raking this sideways with it on an incline tilt, I'm getting a good clean cut with the edge of the teeth on the chainsaw, and also it's riding on a minimal amount of the guide, which almost assures you that you're not going to have any chips underneath it. And you get some roundedness to that surface, which is ideal to me, because you're going to get a nice tight fit because of the curvature of the bar. At least we're going to be using a portion of that curved part. Remove the clamps and off with the fixture. Now, I told you earlier that this adjustment here on the end of the fixture is for your setback. It's already been adjusted because this is really the first notch we've cut today. I'm going to check that, and in this case we've got 6 3/4 because our material is 5 3/4. So we're going to have a 1-inch setback on this. Now on a dovetail, this is what we call a wood-on-wood dovetail. The log above and below are going to directly contact these mating surfaces. So we're talking about a wood-on-wood product. The dovetail measured at its smallest point back here in the throat of the pin. This dimension must equal half of your stack height, provided you want this to fit as snugly as this. If the pin is smaller, then when your logs go together tightly along the wall, if the pin is smaller, it'll be a little bit looser. And don't forget now that if this is not exactly half, if it's a little bit under, and if all the pins are a little bit under, 2 of these pins equal the height of one log. So if we're talking about this being a 1/16 of an inch shy of a perfect half, then our notch is in all likelihood going to be an 1/8 of an inch gap, because we're talking about a 1/16 on one log and a 1/16 on another. Here again, that 1/8 could be divided up depending on how well the notches are fitting to one another. It may go from a 1/16 to an 1/8. But if this is right on, then it should fit pretty snugly along with the rest of the log. When I'm done with this portion, if I can find my little brush, which, there it is, buried, I like to brush the log off. We're blessed with some pretty nice weather up here today. We've had 100-degree weather, but one thing about cleaning off the notch when you get done, especially around wintertime, if you leave a lot of sawdust on here and it happens to get moist tonight and refreezes, you'll be out here in the morning before you're laying logs scraping wood chips off. So I always think it's a good idea for anybody who really cares about their notching. If we can just kind of turn this log towards the camera, we can get a little bit of an idea. Turn your end that way, and we'll tilt her down. And you can kind of see what we've ended up here. I don't know how close you can get with that camera from that angle, but it's a pretty nice smooth surface. And again, these fixtures here, this is about the 30 or 40th house that these fixtures have cut, with a variety of pin sizes, log sizes. But we're always ending up with a good looking notch. The saw, by the way, I've ground the chain on it to where it's basically straight across, but that chain has not been touched since we started this project, and we've done a little over 50 of the notches already. So we'll go ahead and put this log on the pile and get another one. Okay, we just brought this log over here, and this is the second log we've notched on the job. I've already checked for straightness. It looks pretty good. I also would like to check both sides of the log to see if there's any problems with the surface. We've got a little bit of sand, it looks like, right here. Nothing real major, so we'll go ahead and use the log in full length. I'll go ahead and put a notch on this end just like we did last time. In fact, let's roll it over. One of the things that I like to do, we have the chink groove is up here. I like to roll it. If we've got a solid side, I like to mark that side because it's a lot easier to get a straight line all the way across the material. Several different schools of thought about where to put the framing square. I like to rest it on top of the tongues. If you use it across the bottom, a lot of the logs have this center portion a little shallower than each side. So if you're going to use it across the bottom, make sure you bridge from one side to the other rather than coming resting on this center portion. And we'll go ahead and cut this square. Since we're on the subject of this saw, it's 30 pounds, it gets pretty heavy at the end of the day. When you're setting this saw down, it's so easy for this table to get out of adjustment. What I've learned to do is, first of all, I've built in a little thumb hold here so that the guard doesn't slam back. But when I set it down, I always set it on the nose piece, then the motor, then down to the guard on the bottom. And I've not had anything work loose on a saw in that case, so you want to protect that. Go ahead and roll our log up. Fixture on. And a second notch. Again, cutting from the inside. And rolling the log. You begin to see that this is a real good working height for me. So whatever you're going to be cutting as material-wise, make sure you accommodate that with your sawhorses. I always feel like a barber. And we're done. Okay, we've got another log on our sawhorses. It's straight. There's no problems with surface condition. If we had a mark here that an imperfection, whether man or nature made, what I'd like to do is isolate that. I could make that the end of the log and actually put a notch there that might cut the imperfection out. It might be that I can cut one of the pre-cut lengths, like the 39-inch logs that we're using. But there's no marks, no problems on this log, so we're just going to go ahead and square it up. Stand it up. When I'm installing this fixture, I try to keep it forced that way so that you're not inadvertently hitting these screws on the end of the log. One of the things we should have done the first cut we made, we should have checked all of our dimensions, not just the pin length. So when we get done cutting on this one, we'll check the height, make sure it's still in specs, as it has been for a couple days now. One of the beautiful parts about the fixtures themselves, they've really enabled this chainsaw operation to become a lot safer. There's something that's very here. The chain is not flapping around. We do rarely use the nose cutting on when you're using fixtures. It's just the throat of the saw itself. So we're in a pretty safe atmosphere here. Hey, we talked earlier about the height of this pin. The height is measured from the sharp edge created from these two surfaces coming together down to where this point is at its shallowest, back in this very corner. And I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera or not, there's a small flat where the chainsaw, actually when it was cutting this vertical surface here, it went a little bit deeper and went beyond the plane of this surface, so that there was actually a corner back there created. We're going to measure that smallest point through here. And this measurement right here, which is 5 5/8, is exactly half of our 11 1/4. So we're in good shape. The angles are pretty well controlled by the fixture. You shouldn't have to worry about them ever becoming out of adjustment. So the angles are already set with the fixture. This here can be controlled without changing the wear plates simply by the tilt on the saw. And having used this saw for so many times, I know pretty well where to put it. And once this is dialed in and I've got the size that I'm looking for, then I can remember where that tilt is. And tilting it just a little bit, we're talking about 64ths and maybe 32nds of an inch. So you can really fine tune it just with the tilt. Here's an imperfection that we might want to look at. It's probably caused from a peavey or cant hook going into the material before it was even sawn or milled. This will actually be hidden with the dovetail, because when we cut the end of the log off, our dovetail is going to be back this far to the shoulder, so this will be concealed. So this is not a problem. I always like to show off a bit here, and the cut is not perfectly square for an extending pin, though it's well within tolerance. Before this first cut was made on this fixture, I might point out that this is setting back the desired setback, which in this case was 6 3/4, plus an additional 1/4 of an inch back to where these plates are. So this is going to be measuring a little over 7 inches, as you see. In fact, we've actually got it set at about 6 5/8 from here. Or, I'm sorry, 6 7/8, but the cut will be 6 5/8. And you can see here that this saw was really out of alignment when it went down. Another reason for this cleanup pass. overall length, we're a little bit over 3/4 of an inch. Again, this is to allow about a 1-inch overhang on the log, that is. And this one here is measuring 5 and 15/16. So that's going to be a little over 7/8 of an inch beyond the side of the log. Almost irregardless of how sharp your chainsaw is, you're almost always going to have some of this tearing out. I usually leave it on there until the log is going to be put in position, and it will dry out pretty readily, and you can usually just rake your finger around the corner and it breaks it right off. You can cut it off. And you can see it's not doing too bad of a job. We will be doing some experimenting with some chains, actually a cutter on every tooth called a full house chain. We've got some that's going through some testing now for a dry western red cedar. This is yellow pine, I'm sorry, a white pine. It's been air dry, it's relatively dry, and this is after about 60 notches or so that we've cut with that same chain untouched. While we're talking about the chain, we'll just give you a little eyeball on it. We'll go ahead and lock the guard on it. You can see this is sharpened straight across, or I believe there's a 5-degree angle on this. 5-degree on an angle. This is a guarded chain, just like originally comes with the saw. So you've got your safety guards on here. This is a 91 SG chain, a mini 3/8 they call it. The guards have not worked them, the guides have not worked themselves out of adjustment since they were adjusted in, holding up real well. These particular guides have been through now 6 or 8 houses, and I've made some minor adjustments because on every job I go to, I go with about 3 chains to the job site. Some of them are brand new chains that I've reground, some of them are used chains that have been reground. So in any case, when I put a different chain on the bar, I automatically reset this. Okay, on this particular log, before I notched the other end, which we were continually doing, in sighting down the log, we had a little bit of a bend in this area. It wasn't really so radical that we may not have been able to use it, but I already needed some 39-inch logs. I needed one more right and one more left. We're just finished cutting a left-hand notch. I'm going to go ahead and we've been measuring these off the very end. And when you're measuring a log, I might give you a little bit of a hint. If you'll measure down the middle so that if there is any variation in the squareness of the end cut, you'll be pretty much getting an average of that if you measure right off the middle. Our 39 inches. And what we'll do now, this will become a log for the other end of the house up here. If I can get you to catch this, we'll go ahead and cut this one off. When we finished cutting this, we may or may not elect to go ahead and notch this log again. I think I'll go ahead while we've got it here and notch it again, but let me cut our 39-inch log. By the way, when you're cutting a log, if you've got somebody helping you, in order to keep this from binding, it should drop just a little bit and go forward. So it's trying to open that cut up in a downward forward fall, and it shouldn't bind if you follow that direction. And that log will end up going up on the subfloor and eliminate that particular length of log that we need. That one again, if you'll look at it as he's setting it down, that's a left-hand notch. We'll take that one off of our list here. And we'll proceed with another notch on this end. Notice that when I've finished making that first vertical cut, I usually leave the saw in place. I guess you might say it's been too many times that I've taken the saw out, and while it's still running, I've ended up nicking the fixture. So it just, I found it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth my time to go ahead and get that saw out. So just go ahead and leave it in there until the saw quits turning. And again, rather than moving the saw, I go ahead and get the block of wood out of the way first, because if you try to lift this and it hooks that block and throws it someplace or makes sure it causes your saw to jump in your fixture, it's just not worth it. So go ahead and get that out of the way and proceed. When you're finished making a cut, it might be a good idea, rather than just leaving your saw laying in an open area like this where people are continually walking around, especially blindly, I might add, trying to tote a long log and walking backwards. They could easily walk into this with their ankle or shin and get a pretty nice little cut. If you've got some place that you can set your saw, at least to where your bar is concealed underneath the pile of logs, nice and safe, I like to perhaps even put it underneath the sawhorses, because we're always working out in this area. It's just a little safer that way. What we're going to do now is something that we would, usually when you're starting a house, you would start with a half log on a dovetail type home. And these are both half logs. They're exactly half the same, half the height of the original log. And what we're going to do in order to cut these half logs into both starter and cap, we're going to put them back together, and we'll literally just take and reassemble these halves. The ends have been square cut individually. I'm going to slide this out this way, go ahead and put our fixture on, and it is the other fixture. And just clamp it down as you normally would. We'll go ahead and machine both of them as they were one. And just to illustrate the point, we've got a fairly short piece here. That was the bottom of the notch. This will actually be the cap log that goes on the top of the wall. To start the half log wall, we'll call this a starter course, so that you can begin to see a full notch sitting on here. All the bottoms will be the same, and we'll be walking around the house here just to kind of check the guys out, see what they've been doing. You'll see these half log starter courses in place. So here we've taken a full log, machined it for the cap that goes on the top of the wall. In fact, if we had a full log right here, it would be flush at the top and the bottom with these two pieces. So that's starter and cap, cap and starter. You can cut this on the job site. One thing you might want to consider, if you have a full log, and let's say you have an imperfection on the bottom side, you could literally position that to, or actually it'd be on the top side or midway through the log. You could go ahead and cut your regular log and saw it right down the middle to create your starter and cap. A key point to remember, the starter, not necessarily the cap, but the starter needs to be as close to half of the stack height as possible. This can be a little bit shy of half that height, so that your saw kerf is actually ending up coming out on your cap log. The starter needs to be exactly half the same height, or half the height of your stack log. So if you've got 11 1/4 over here, this needs to be 5 5/8 on your stack. Well, now that we've got all of our dovetail notches cut for the house, what I wanted to talk about for just a minute before we go over here and look at some of the work that's been done, we can mark these if we had something we wanted to communicate on the log. Remember that whatever you've allowed as an extension here, you don't want to get any markings on that. But we can certainly put a mark on here. It remains visible from the end of the pile, so if you had a length, you can either put your length up here. If this was a 10 foot, I might elect to put a 10 and indicate the length also in inches, or we can also write down here some kind of information. You'll get used to the fact that when you look at the outside of the log, we can see that this is a right hand, but I've seen people come on down and put indicate that this is a right hand. You can, once again, you can write your length information and your notch configuration here. If your house has an interior corner, you'll actually see some pretty strange looking notches, because it's possible to have a notch just reversed of this, where it's actually crossing on the inside of the house rather than on an outside corner. So you may run into some peculiar looking notches, so pay particular attention to what you're doing. Anyway, you can communicate on the end of the log out here. It remains visible. Do not mark on the end of the log, because that, of course, remains visible after the home is built. You want to try and keep that as clean as possible. Don't be hitting it with a hammer to knock it in place. That's pretty much it. Let's take a look at the house here. We've got a corner that is right near your camera that we can look at, and just see how close the notches have been. If I can come around here, you can see we talk about the pin extension, in this case of 1 inch. You can see that we're getting some pretty tight fits here. The overcut that actually was done on the bottom of this notch has literally disappeared. You can see the overcut on the top here that's still remaining visible, but when the next notch goes in place here, that'll pretty much disappear, as you can see down here. But this is what you're going to remain visible. So you don't want to have any of your marks out here on the top of your log that you'll see afterwards. You want to keep this real clear. Down at the bottom, you can see, and while you're looking at that down there, I'm going to reach behind me and get a starter course. Well, they're all too long for me to grab over here. But this being the starter course, it's our half log. It started directly on top of the foundation. And this being our first full log on the adjacent wall, usually you will start and end with a full log on the sides of the house that run parallel with the ridge beam, so that in the case when you get up the top of the wall, you wanted a full log to continue out and catch the overhang on the ends with like a barge rafter carrier. You can do that with a full log. So you start with a half log on the ends of the house and full log on the sides parallel with the ridge. That's a general statement. But you can see we're getting some pretty good notches here. In this case, they're spiking the corner. There are different ways of attachment. We're not going to get into that today. Caulking. If I was caulking the house, I might run a bead of caulk on the top of the tongue, down this face, across and over, and down to this tongue, so that you've got a complete seal all the way around the corner if I were caulking. Foam is generally placed here in the middle. There's not enough room in here for a full strip of foam because we just didn't allow for it. If you're going to have foam, you need to somehow relieve some material in here so that there's room for that foam. And of course, you don't want to run your excuse me. You don't want to be running your foam through a hole like this. You'll run it around to the outside. And if I can walk down beside you here, let's see what we've got along the side.
Well, it's 30 foot.
We've got some seams here about every 8 feet. A good stagger pattern. If you're building your own house and you're cutting your logs to length, the easy way out is to take all your 8-foot logs and run them every other pattern so that you've got a zipper running up the wall. I would strongly advise, if you've got shorter and longer logs alternating in length, that you also alter or stagger the butt joints between the logs so that you don't have this zipper effect. We've got about a 4-foot space in here, plenty adequate. And you can see that they're starting to move on up the wall up here at the top. We'll be coming back later on and looking at this structure. But you can pretty well see how the log walls go together. This is their chink space outside, whereas the inside is just a total V-joint. And we're going to pretty much shut things down here. One other thing that I should have mentioned maybe right up front, we didn't pre-cut these logs for this particular house. They're cutting them as they install them. You need to determine how much overhang you're going to allow for this to extend beyond the face of your subfloor. They can come back, or you can come back and put a fascia board on that, and if it's going to be 3/4, you might consider hanging this over 3/4 so that when you come back and put your fascia board on, everything's nice and flush. I've seen people also to really stagger these way out here and bring stone up underneath. Whatever you're going to do at the end, you need to account for that in your log lengths and your overhang on this first course. Because this particular log and also the bottom of the starter course had a grooved pattern, you want to be awfully careful about what's underneath here to physically set that log on. You want to make sure that you've got enough material there for this log wall to be load-bearing and give you some nice firm support. I'm pretty much a proponent of setting it on the subfloor as opposed to setting it directly on the foundation and building a subfloor inside. I believe that this is the system that I would elect to use, merely because I don't like to have seams between the log wall and the subfloor that might get moist and trap that moisture. This way, it's all exposed above the subfloor. We can now work on keeping it waterproof here at this juncture. And that's about it. We'll come back here in maybe on a not so distant video. We'll come back and look at this house, and we'll take one from the ground up. So again, this is Ed Miller, and thanks for coming out here. You might stick around. We'll watch the sunset after.